It's a great honor to be here with you this morning, and congratulations to South Korea for the successful hosting of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics. We're meeting at a time where this is a continuing part of the dialogue and the analysis that President Park mentioned, and my deep thanks to KFES for hosting this talk today as well. What I wanted to do today is present some key findings from ongoing research, and particularly for my comments today, looking at recent meetings in Washington and some of the Asian capitals as well. The North Korean nuclear issue is certainly advancing in a way that there are signs of optimism, but the underlying momentum, I think, is still continuing. So the way that I wanted to frame my comments is frankly in terms of a time series. I wanted to direct your attention to July of 2017, February of 2018, this month, and April of 2018. So if you look at it through those three lenses, to begin with, as President Park mentioned, July, in my estimation, was an inflection point. With the first North Korean nuclear, not nuclear, but ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile tests, on July 4th, we saw a fundamental reorientation in terms of how the North Korean threat was being viewed by Washington. And very soon after that, the second ICBM tests, a mere weeks after, on July 28th, reinforced that assessment. So what is this inflection point? North Korea has traditionally been viewed as the threat over there, the threat to American allies and American interests in the Northeast Asian region. But with the ICBM tests that were estimated to be able to range first on July 4th, Alaska, and then second, July 28th, about half of the continental United States, the threat perception of North Korea shifted from a regional threat to a direct threat to the American homeland, the continental United States. So you can imagine in such a short period of time, for this type of technology to be demonstrated, and the caveat is that North Korea is still developing, but to demonstrate this capability sent shockwaves. And with that, the orientation of dealing with North Korea going forward, as we're seeing now, as very much this priority. I would argue that for the US government, for the US military, for the intelligence community, North Korea is the number one threat. It has essentially replaced terrorism from the number one spot at this present point in time. To reinforce, I think, the gravity of the situation, what I wanted to do first was show you the analysis that our colleagues at CSIS had conducted related to North Korean ballistic missile testing and nuclear testing. And in the latter part of my talk, I'll look at the implications for South Korea. So if you look at the period of Kim Il-sung when he was active with missiles, you're looking at a period in the early 1980s where predominantly those missiles were for sale. This was a revenue stream for the North Korea regime at that time. And in the early 1980s, North Korea was selling both to Iran and Iraq during the Iran-Iraq War. Later on, we see North Korea develop other capabilities, but still with this emphasis predominantly on sales as revenue generation. Now that model, that business model shifted. Under the 17 years of Kim Jong-il's rule, we see increased activity. But the two takeaways here that I wanted to highlight, first was 1998. This is when North Korea tested the Taepodong-1, which flew over Japan and created a national security crisis in Japan. And this is where we see the investment and the focus on developing military capabilities for defense purposes as it pertains to the North Korean threat. A lot of the framing and the language that is coming out of Washington right now is very similar to the language that came out of Japan in Tokyo after this Taepodong-1 overflight. Later on in Kim Jong-il's tenure, we see the increasing tempo of these tests. So during the 17 years of Kim Jong-il's rule, we saw about 16 significant ballistic missile tests, 1-6. And what has become now to be known as the Kim Jong-il playbook focused on the idea of doing a test with the idea of trying to have some commercial application. For a moratorium, what could North Korea receive? North Korea certainly did the nuclear tests, and first one was in 2006. Technical experts believe this one to be not successful in the sense that it was estimated to be under 1 kiloton yield. The second test that North Korea conducted in 2009 gave the sense that North Korea was making progress towards nuclear weapons design as well for the warheads. Now we fast forward to the current period, and this gives you the sense of context. Already there was elevated concern. And just to put into context how we saw July. This is the little over 6 years of Kim Jong-un's time at the helm. And what we're seeing are a number of takeaways. One is different types of missile technologies. We're also seeing the type of ranges that have increased. Earlier, there were spectacular failures, but remarkably, in a very short period of time, North Korea was improving in terms of these type of technologies. We know this because North Korea posts the videos and the photos after a successful test. And so there is something of a democratization of the information related to North Korea's ballistic missile program. The other takeaway is that if you look at the red dots here, and predominantly in the last period, the last column in 2017, North Korea conducted its 6th nuclear test, and this one registered 6.3 on the Richter scale. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that this is a man-made earthquake. 6.3 on the Richter scale gave a sense of the magnitude. It is still unclear if this is in the thermonuclear category, but as the technical experts would say, this is sufficient in terms of yield to give the consideration that North Korea is making significant strides in this area. But the part that created the sense of urgency, even more so, were the tests in July. These are the blue lines here. The first one, July 4th. This one was estimated to go higher than farther, but if you flatten the trajectory, this is where the July 4th test was estimated to be able to range Alaska. July 28th test was able to range midway, about Chicago if you think of geography. And then the last, most recent ballistic missile test on the ICBM scale, the November 28th Hwasong 15. This one is estimated to be able to range the totality of the continental United States. So this gives you a sense how July, beginning in July, and then reinforced, and especially with the November 28th test, North Korea is again viewed as the threat that is direct to the American homeland. There are a number of implications to this, and I'll mention that for the South Korean side. But I wanted to zero in on the second part of my talk, which is looking at the period now. February of 2018 has been remarkable in terms of the inter-Korean dialogue that has been taking place. Starting with Kim Jong-un's New Year's address, and then very soon after that, the first inter-Korean meeting on January 9th that led to the series of meetings, and most recently where we saw the delegation led by Kim Yong-chol. This is a type of dialogue that raises an important distinction. The formal name of North Korea, of the North Korea policy under the Trump administration is maximum pressure and engagement. But the distinction that has to be made is that there is one definition of maximum pressure. That is the two pillars of that being military pressure and economic pressure. There is very little discrepancy in terms of understanding of what maximum pressure means. However, under engagement, we have differing interpretations of what that means. A US approach, if you look at the US definition of engagement right now by the US administration, it focuses on a conditional statement. There will be talks in terms of this type of diplomatic engagement. There will be no talks, I should say, until there is denuclearization in North Korea. So very similar to the CVID, the complete verifiable, irreversible disarmament formulation that we saw in the first Bush administration, there are some interesting parallels. Now, the definition of, and the operating definition of engagement for the South Korean side seems to differ. This one focuses more on this process leading to, hopefully, progress on denuclearization overall, but in the early stages, to have this inter-Korean type of dialogue to create the situation and foundation for further talks. The caveat, though, for the South Korean interpretation of engagement is that it is stripped down in terms of the narrow focus on trying to bring down the level of tensions. Whereas for the American definition of engagement, the conditionality of it, and also this idea that denuclearization is at the forefront. So these are the two different definitions of engagement that I think is a central focus of this month, February 2018. This is an area where if there isn't a closing of that definition and eventually an adoption of the same definition, we could see Seoul and Washington go in different directions as they adhere to their interpretation and their definition of engagement. Now, the remarkable thing about the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics as well is that if you look at it, and it is in the rearview mirror now, it's still close, but it is behind us, there was de facto freeze for freeze. We didn't see North Korea conducting any nuclear tests or ballistic missile tests. And we also had the postpone and some would interpret it as a freeze in the US-South Korea military exercise. But the hope that we can continue with this situation, I think that is something we have to manage our expectations because we are now seeing the discussions and preparations for the resumption of US-South Korea military exercises. And this brings me to the third part of my talk, April 2018. That is roughly the date where we're anticipating the US-South Korea resume military exercises to take place. And it's during this time frame that we're going to see the resumption the return of maximum pressure in its full dimensions, both military pressure and economic pressure. Certainly during the Winter Olympics itself, we saw the next round of economic pressure, and this was related to the new announcement of another round of sanctions. On the sanctions piece, we are moving away from targeted sanctions to more along the lines of what some of the economists who analyze some of these sanctions measures call embargo. Initially, there's an effort to reduce significantly the flow of oil from China into North Korea. There has certainly been the sectoral ban, essentially China committing not to purchasing North Korean coal. And now with the idea of the shipping component, the naval aspect of it, some are likening it to the early stages of a naval blockade as it relates to the maritime interdiction, and specifically focusing on North Korea's coping mechanism of smuggling activity. So on the sanctions piece, as interpreted in terms of maximum pressure, that is certainly increasing, and there is efforts and there's plans to increase that even more. As we focus on the April piece of the timeline here, and the return of maximum pressure, this is an area where I think we're watching very closely, because the calm of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics could be quickly overshadowed by the elevated tensions that we are anticipating in April. So let me look at, under that heading of what we are anticipating for the spring, the topic of the implications for South Korea. In South Korean media, there has been this term, Korea passing. But I think one way to interpret and tie the different pieces that I've presented here, largely because of the events of July last year with the 2 ICBM tests and North Korea posing a direct threat to the American homeland, in an operational sense, the question is, did we not just see, not necessarily Korea passing, but the phenomenon of Korea past? What I mean by that is that as North Korea became this direct threat to the American homeland, the President of the United States, in his capacity also as Commander-in-Chief, could act directly in response to what is perceived to be an imminent North Korean attack. So this is an area where it would not merit or require consultation with South Korea and South Korean president. Under the US-South Korea alliance structure, unprecedented structure for the United States, nowhere around the world does the United States military have this type of intertwined command structure, and also the consultations at the senior leadership levels. And traditionally, that has been the way that the two leaders have dealt with it. Any threat coming from North Korea and the potential use of force to deal with that threat has been very much the focus of consultation between US and South Korean leaders. But because of July and this phenomenon of Korean past, we are entering uncharted territory in many respects. And so with this and the steps going forward, this is a type of issue that I think the comparisons to previous cycles of how we've dealt with the North Korean threat, there are fewer and fewer carryovers from that experience and that case study. Let me conclude with what I see in terms of Washington circles within the government, two schools of thought related to the North Korean issue. One school of thought is that the whole notion of deterring and containing North Korea, so essentially a non-military option to address this immediate rising threat, is disputed in the sense that when you look at North Korea, first off, let me actually start with a group that supports deterring and containing North Korea. And this is, I think, broadly a Secretary Mattis type of viewpoint. That is Secretary of Defense Mattis, that is closely held by Secretary of State Tillerson. And that is the view that the United States has tremendous capability and tremendous experience deterring and containing nuclear adversaries. First the Soviet Union and now Russia and China. And that those capabilities definitely carry over and are applicable to dealing with this North Korean threat, even at this range of threatening the continental United States. And on top of that, the message is all of the testing that we've seen is building towards demonstrating viable prototype, that North Korea would still have to build out an inventory. So the takeaways from that message is that it is a message of hope that we have these capabilities in place. North Korea can be deterred and contained, and drawing on that experience. The second message is that the urgency of the situation in that context and that interpretation is very measured. This idea that we do have time, we can develop different policies and strategies to address this quickly evolving threat. Countering that interpretation in that school of thought is the view that if you think of a window closing, North Korea developing this capability presents a diminishing opportunity. So this idea that we have to stop it now. And unfortunately, in that interpretation, the view of the previous examples of deterring and containing a nuclear China and a nuclear Soviet Union are not transferable. Because in those instances, the United States was deterring a country, a group, an organization. But in the North Korean case, the United States would essentially be trying to deter an individual. And this is Kim Jong-un, a millennial with nuclear ICBMs. And framed that way, very difficult for some of the national security establishment in the government in Washington to see this as something that we live with, but rather something that even with this window closing, the US effort focusing on trying to prevent this. Hence the greater focus, not only on the economic part of maximum pressure, but certainly a greater focus on the military part of maximum pressure. And I'll close with this. In that assessment, Kim Jong-un is almost framed as a part of an equation. Kim Jong-un equals irrational, plus undeterrable, plus revisionist, and plus commercial. What that means is that as an individual, if he is deemed to be irrational, the deterrence could not potentially work in the sense that you need to have this ability to do the deterrence signaling and the deterrence management. The part about undeterrable is what I referred to earlier, that despite the capabilities and the track record of the United States entering into relationships of deterring and containing other nuclear adversaries, that this is not a comparable situation. The third piece of it, revisionist, is a concern that if North Korea gets to that level under the Pyeongjin formulation of parallel development of nuclear weapons and focusing on economic prosperity, North Korea doesn't become a peaceful nuclear weapon state, but rather a nuclear bully, and hence that formulation of revisionist. And then finally, commercial is the sense that a nuclear North Korea would sell nuclear technology and nuclear weapon systems. And here the concern is to Iran. So you can see how with that formulation, there is that sense of urgency. And unfortunately, the message in terms of how you deal with that type of formulation is some aspects of increased military pressure. And some of it we've seen referenced in the press as the bloody nose thesis. So we are now in this context of trying to manage all of these different interpretations. But one thing to remember is in previous cycles of dealing with the North Korean threat, there were largely commonly understood definitions and policies related to North Korea. Right now, not only one country having a different type of understanding and assessment of North Korea, but different interest groups within the countries. So this diversity of the facts, as it were, and the interpretation of those facts, leads to fundamental management challenges as we enter this phase of ever more increasing tensions. So with that, let me conclude and move to the next phase. Thank you very much.